There was a time when the M1 Abrams was seen as too heavy, too exposed, and too slow to survive for long on the battlefields of Ukraine. In the age of FP5 drones, many believed that expensive tanks like these would sooner or later be pushed away from the front line. But what is happening now points to a different path. Ukraine is not giving up on the Abrams. Ukraine is trying to turn it into a tank that can survive drone attacks more effectively while still keeping its firepower and its real combat role. And if that approach proves effective, this story will not stop with just a few tanks on the battlefield. It could become a lesson big enough that even the United States may have to pay attention. But how exactly has Ukraine changed the Abrams? Why are these changes different from many of the heavy armor modifications that appeared earlier in the war? And could this be a sign that tanks are not disappearing, but entering a completely new phase of adaptation? Let military force take a closer look. Ukraine is redesigning the M1 Abrams for a battlefield where survival means more than simply adding protection. The goal is not only to shield the crew from first-person view drones, but also to keep the tank able to fire its main gun under constant pressure from the air. That point matters because a tank that can absorb danger but cannot return fire is no longer doing the job it was built to do. On today's front, the real test is whether armor can still function as armor while drones watch almost every movement. This is why the Abrams is being treated as a combat tool that must stay useful, not as a machine that only needs to last a few minutes longer. Ukraine is trying to preserve the core role of a main battle tank. It still has to move through dangerous ground, support infantry, and deliver direct fire against strong points or exposed positions. In other words, the value of the upgrade lies in preserving combat function. Protection matters, but protection alone is not enough if the tank loses its ability to shape the fight. That makes this redesign part of a larger attempt to keep heavy armor relevant in a war where the sky itself has become a permanent source of danger. That approach reflects a deeper change in modern warfare. Heavy armor, a large gun, and advanced systems still matter, but they no longer guarantee battlefield relevance on their own. A tank that pauses too long can be tracked. A tank that cannot respond quickly can lose the initiative. A tank that cannot work with nearby infantry can become isolated and vulnerable. The challenge is no longer just stopping a hit. It is surviving long enough to keep firing, keep moving, and keep supporting the wider assault inside an area watched by drones. Ukraine is not presenting the Abrams as an unstoppable weapon. It is trying to adapt it to a battlefield where mobility, firepower, and survivability must exist at the same time. That is what makes this effort important. It suggests the future of tanks may depend less on raw armor thickness and more on whether they can remain effective under permanent surveillance and fast attack. And to reach that balance, Ukraine is not relying on one simple answer. It is pushing different units to test different forms of protection on the Abrams, searching for a design that helps the tank survive without stripping away its real purpose. That search opens the way for the next stage of this story, where battlefield adaptation becomes a race of ideas as much as a clash of firepower. Ukraine's effort to protect the Abrams has grown into a broad field experiment shaped by several combat units rather than by one single design team. That matters because the drone threat changes too quickly for a slow and centralized process to keep pace with events at the front. Instead of waiting for a final model, Ukrainian formations are testing different ideas under real fire and adjusting them through direct battlefield experience. This makes the Abrams story less about one dramatic upgrade and more about a practical search for a form of protection that can survive present conditions. The wider meaning is important. In modern war, adaptation often begins with crews, mechanics, and assault units that face the threat first and cannot afford to rely on theory alone. Within that process, the 47th Mechanized Brigade represents the more foundational layer of this effort. Its role points to a method focused on strengthening the Abrams at the baseline level through added explosive reactive armor and extra side protection. That kind of work may look less spectacular than larger metal frames, but it matters because survival often depends on whether a vehicle can absorb a first strike without losing key systems or crew safety. A stronger base also gives the tank more freedom to stay active in dangerous areas for the short periods that modern combat now allows. This does not solve every problem created by drones. It does, however, improve the tank's chances of remaining useful long enough to support infantry, fire on defended positions, and withdraw before the next attack arrives. The 425th Assault Regiment appears to push the concept further by focusing on the moment just before impact. Its reported use of large frames and spine structures reflects a simple but important idea. If a first-person view drone can be forced to explode before reaching the turret roof, hull, or another sensitive point, the damage may be reduced enough to keep the vehicle in action. That matters on a battlefield where even one successful drone strike can end a mission, expose nearby troops, and force an entire assault element to stop moving. The 1st Assault Regiment seems to go even further. Its approach suggests that protection is being arranged not only to absorb or disrupt the strike, but also to preserve the Abrams as a functioning combat system. That makes its work especially important because protection that destroys combat utility can save the machine and still waste the mission. Taken together, these efforts show that Ukraine is evolving the Abrams through comparison, repetition, and practical trial, rather than through one fixed answer imposed from above. One unit strengthens basic survivability. Another tries to defeat the drone before direct contact. Another searches for a structure that protects the tank without stripping away its battlefield purpose. That pattern shows how innovation now rises from the front line, where technical ideas are judged by whether they keep a vehicle moving and a crew alive for one more engagement. It also explains why this stage of the story matters beyond the Abrams itself. Ukraine is not merely adding more metal. It is testing how armor should work in a war where drones, surveillance, and rapid strike cycles punish every exposed weakness. In that sense, each modified Abrams becomes part workshop, part battlefield test, and part warning about how fast armored doctrine must change when cheap aircraft can threaten machines that once dominated open ground with little challenge from above for a few more dangerous minutes there. And yet, even after all these changes, one question still matters more than the rest. The issue is not how much protection can be welded onto the tank. The issue is whether the Abrams can still fight like a real tank once that protection is in place. The most important change in Ukraine's Abrams upgrade is not simply the addition of more metal. It is the fact that the new protection does not lock the turret in place, as many early turtle tank designs effectively did. That detail may sound technical, but in combat it shapes whether the vehicle remains a real tank or turns into a slower armored shell. A tank earns its value not only by surviving enemy fire, but by reacting quickly, aiming across different angles, and delivering direct force when seconds matter. If that ability is weakened too much, the vehicle may still look protected, yet its real battlefield role begins to shrink. This is why turret movement sits at the center of the problem. On the modern battlefield, threats rarely appear only from the front. They can emerge from tree lines, trench systems, side roads, ruined buildings, or positions revealed only for a few moments. In such conditions, the crew often has very little time to identify a target and return fire. If the turret cannot rotate freely, that response slows down at exactly the moment speed is most important. The result is not only weaker offense, it also means weaker self-protection, because a tank that cannot answer fast from the side or rear becomes more vulnerable even when its armor is thicker. Earlier anti-drone cage designs improve survival in one sense, but often did so by limiting flexibility in another. They gave crews more shielding from attacks above, yet many also reduced how far or how quickly the turret could move. That trade can look acceptable in a photograph, where added steel suggests greater security. In real fighting, the cost is much clearer. A tank that must turn its entire body instead of rotating its turret becomes slower, easier to predict, and less able to support infantry facing sudden resistance. If a hostile position appears on a flank, even a short delay can change the outcome of the moment. Ukraine appears to be targeting that exact weakness. The goal is not only to stop the drone farther from the armor. The goal is to keep the tank tactically alive after the protection is installed. That is what makes this design effort more serious than a field improvisation. Ukraine is trying to preserve the Abrams as a functioning combat system, not just as a machine that can absorb punishment. The tank still has to engage strong points, answer sudden threats, and cover friendly troops with direct fire under pressure. This reflects a deeper lesson from the war. Protection that destroys battlefield responsiveness is not a full solution. It may help the vehicle endure a strike, but it can still remove the reason to use that vehicle in the first place. Ukraine seems to understand that a tank must remain dangerous, not merely durable. Keeping turret traverse therefore protects more than a moving part. It protects decision speed, firing options, and the ability to control several angles in real time. This is also why the upgrade has wider meaning beyond one unit or one engagement. It suggests that future armor design will be judged not only by how much punishment a vehicle can absorb, but by whether protection allows the crew to keep fighting effectively under constant drone pressure. That shift could influence not only Ukraine's operations, but also how NATO armies think about tanks, crew survival, and battlefield adaptation in wars where cheap drones can shape every movement. From this point, the contrast with many Russian turtle tank designs starts to become much clearer. The difference is no longer only visual. It is a difference in what protection is meant to preserve once the fighting begins. Russia's answer to the drone threat has often been to add more physical protection to its tanks, but that solution has carried a serious price. Extra armor, cages, chains, and improvised structures may increase survival in one narrow sense, yet many of these vehicles become heavier, slower, and less flexible once they move under real combat pressure. On a battlefield where danger can appear from above, from the flank, or only seconds after detection, those losses matter almost as much as the added steel itself. A tank is not judged only by whether it can absorb a strike. It is judged by whether it can still move, react, fire, and reposition before another threat arrives. That is where many Russian turtle tank concepts seem to run into trouble. They reflect the logic of covering as much as possible, but they often do so at the expense of the qualities that gave tanks their value in the first place. In trying to survive everything, some of these vehicles risk becoming less capable of doing anything quickly or effectively. That trade becomes even more dangerous in an environment shaped by constant drone observation. A tank that moves slowly across open ground gives enemy operators more time to track it, study its route, and prepare the next strike. A vehicle that struggles to turn or withdraw after firing stays exposed longer, which increases the chance of follow-up attacks by more drones, artillery, or anti-armor teams. Even when the first hit does not destroy the tank, the delay created by excessive protection can leave it trapped in the most dangerous phase of the engagement. In that sense, too much armor can begin to undermine the survival it was supposed to improve. Weight becomes a problem. Speed becomes a problem. Maneuver becomes a problem. The tank may look stronger, but its battlefield options shrink. This is why appearance can be misleading. A machine covered in steel may seem safer from a distance, yet under drone pressure it can become easier to predict and easier to finish off. When survival reduces mobility too far, protection stops being a full answer and starts becoming part of the problem itself. Ukraine appears to be searching for a different balance. The goal is not to make the Abrams light, elegant, or untouched by battlefield improvisation. It is willing to accept a bulkier profile if the tank can still move well enough for short attacks, still fire effectively, and still leave the danger zone before enemy systems complete their response cycle. That marks a very different philosophy from turning a tank into a heavily wrapped shell that survives but cannot shape the fight. A vehicle that remains intact yet cannot support infantry, exploit a weak point, or escape the next strike has preserved metal, but not real combat value. This is the deeper contrast between the two approaches. Both sides understand that drones have made traditional armored exposure far more dangerous. The difference lies in what each side seems willing to sacrifice. One approach accepts major losses in mobility and utility for more shielding. The other tries to keep enough mobility and enough firepower that the tank remains a real battlefield asset. And once that balance changes, the Abrams can no longer be used according to the old logic of large, sustained, mechanized breakthrough assaults. The role of tanks is changing because the battlefield around them has changed first. Ukraine is trying to use modified tanks in a different way as Russia reduces large, mechanized assaults and relies more on light vehicles or small infantry groups. Instead of pushing armor forward as the spearhead of a deep breakthrough, it is using it for short attacks against isolated defensive pockets, then pulling it back before the enemy can respond. That shift reflects the pressure created by drones. Large armored assaults have become more expensive and dangerous than they once were. A column that moves too openly can be spotted quickly, tracked from above, and struck in sequence before it reaches its objective. This is one reason both sides have had to rethink how they use armored vehicles. The old logic of massed movement is harder to sustain when the sky is filled with drones. Ukraine's answer has not been to remove tanks from the battlefield. It has been to narrow their mission and sharpen timing. In this model, the tank is not expected to stay exposed for long periods or carry the burden of an advance. Its job is more focused. It moves in fast, delivers heavy direct fire against a strong point or exposed position, creates shock, and then leaves before enemy drones and artillery complete the cycle of detection and strike. That is why the modified Abrams fits a flash assault. Its value lies in speed of action rather than length of presence. A few extra minutes in the wrong place can turn a successful attack into a trap. That method reduces exposure, preserves scarce armor, and turns each attack into a controlled action instead of a long gamble. Used this way, the Abrams becomes less a vehicle for sustained armored thrust and more a burst of battlefield force. That does not make it less important. In some situations, it may make it more useful. A tank that arrives at the right moment can break a firing point, suppress defenders, and open a path for others to move. But that only works when the tank is part of a wider combat system. It performs best when paired with drones that locate targets first, with supporting fire that weakens resistance, and with infantry ready to exploit what the tank has disrupted. Without that coordination, even a modified Abrams would remain vulnerable. With it, the tank regains value as one element inside a timed combat sequence. This is the deeper meaning of the change. Ukraine is not trying to return armored warfare to an older form. It is adapting the tank to a battlefield where exposure is punished faster and more precisely than before. The tank still matters, but it matters differently. Its function is no longer to dominate space through long movement. Its function is to deliver short windows of heavy force at the moment when the enemy is least able to respond. That also explains why these upgrades matter so much as Ukraine tries to keep momentum in the south. These upgrades are appearing at a very important moment for Ukraine in the south, where progress depends on brief tactical openings rather than long periods of exposed movement. In this sector, even a local attack can fail quickly if armored support arrives too slowly or stays visible for too long. The battlefield there punishes hesitation. Reconnaissance drones can detect movement early. FPV drones can follow within minutes. Artillery can then strike the same area before a unit has time to settle, reload, or recover. That means every vehicle entering the fight must do useful work almost immediately. It must survive the first burst of danger, deliver force at the point of contact, and leave before the enemy completes the full response cycle. This is why the modified Abrams matters in the south more than it might in a less saturated battle space. It gives Ukraine a heavier option for short missions in areas where lighter vehicles may lack the protection or firepower needed to break a defended position under pressure. The value of that kind of tank is tied to timing as much as armor. Ukraine does not need a vehicle that simply remains present. It needs one that can create results inside a very narrow window. A modified Abrams can strike a hard point, shield nearby infantry for a short push, and help exploit a local opening before the enemy closes it from above. That role is especially important in the south, where tactical opportunities may appear briefly and then disappear under drone observation and indirect fire. In those moments, a platform with strong direct fire and enough survivability to stay active for a few decisive minutes can offer more than a light vehicle and more protection than infantry alone. That is why the real importance of these upgrades is operational, not symbolic. They help Ukraine keep heavy firepower relevant on a front where traditional armored methods are too risky, but complete dependence on lighter forces is not enough. What gives this effort meaning is not spectacle, but the ability to keep one of the battlefield's strongest tools usable in conditions that now punish weight, delay, and predictable movement with speed. And from that reality, a broader conclusion starts to emerge. The Abrams is not becoming a miracle weapon. It is becoming an example of how tanks may still matter when they are adapted to the demands of modern war. Ukraine has not turned the Abrams into a miracle weapon. What it has done is more important. It has shown that a tank can still matter in a battlefield ruled by drones if it is adapted with care, speed, and realism. The goal is not invincibility. The goal is to keep the vehicle alive, mobile, and able to fight under constant pressure. That is the real lesson here. Drone warfare does not erase armor overnight, but it does force armor to change its design, its mission, and the way commanders use it in combat. The deeper significance goes beyond Ukraine. Many armies will face the same challenge as cheap drones spread across future battlefields. The central question is no longer whether tanks will survive as a category. It is whether militaries can adapt them fast enough to preserve their real combat value under the intense conditions of modern war today everywhere. If this report helped you understand not just how wars are fought, but why peace is always more valuable than victory on paper, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every battle reveals the cost of delay, miscalculation, and destruction, and that is exactly why informed discussion matters. Stay with Military Force for clear analysis that studies war seriously, so people never forget the true value of peace.